The Flying Dutchman was followed almost straight away by Tannhäuser, another tale of a doomed man redeemed by love. And here again, Wagner is clearly at some pains to create a realistic framework, in this case by specifying a definite historical setting, which is the Wartburg near Eisenach in Thuringia at the beginning of the 13th century, which was the heyday of the cult of courtly love celebrated by great Männersänger such as Walter von der Vogelweide and Wolfram von Eschenbach, both of whom were real historical persons whom Wagner chooses to cast as supporting characters in the opera itself. But then, as before in The Flying Dutchman, Wagner introduces a supernatural element that disrupts this hitherto quite believable and ordinary situation. Only this time, rather differently, not by allowing a demonic figure to invade our world, but by having an initially ordinary mortal magically transported into another world, from which he then returns a changed man. And this time, the dynamic is one most familiar today from children's literature, where such seemingly innocent objects as a rabbit hole or a wardrobe can serve as portals to the beyond. Wagner's version of this pattern is decidedly for adults only, as the realm Tannhäuser visits is ruled by the pagan goddess Venus, and as her chosen lover, he there enjoys a prolonged and extravagant erotic satisfaction. So that when he returns to the Wartburg, he scandalizes the court by singing the praises of the goddess, a frank celebration of carnal desire that completely violates the accepted codes of chaste love, and leading ultimately to his banishment and effective excommunication. But then again, like the Dutchman before him, his redemption comes through the pure love of a virginal heroine, only this time, ironically, one who has become spellbound through his very singing. As she eloquently confesses in the following passage from Act 2, "But what new worlds outspread before me when thy dear song upon me stole. At first a thrill of pain came o'er me, then floods of joy o'erwhelmed my soul. New raptures that I scarce could measure awoke within my trembling breast, and lost was every girlish pleasure in longings ne'er before confessed." Now there's an obvious implication here that the heroine has, in an almost literal sense, felt ravished by this music. Now this is hardly a normal response, except, however, that it turns out to be a well-documented phenomenon among many of Wagner's own listeners. Those who succumb to what Tanner, for example, has described as an astonishingly persuasive mixture of something like sex and religion, a transcendence of the ordinary conditions of life which is, as many have remarked, the prolonged artistic equivalent of an orgasm. And as Brian McGee backs him up in his early book, Aspects of Wagner, the devotion aroused in some people by Wagner's music is different in kind from that aroused by any other composers. It is like being in love, a kind of madness, a kind of worship, an irrational commitment yet abandonment, which, among other things, dissolves the critical faculty. Now, assuming that Wagner was aware of having this effect on at least some of his listeners, and it's hard to see how it could have been otherwise, I believe that the references in Tannhäuser to raptures that I scarce could measure and so on acknowledge this effect and express a supremely gratifying sense that he must have derived from it. The music certainly appears to confirm this, It voices the same overpowering will that we've already heard in the case of the Flying Dutchman, only this time freed from frustration and exulting in its triumph. There's more. There's another significant detail about Tannhäuser, which is that it also gives a vivid expression to the literally sexual experience that has inspired its libidinous artist hero in the first place. And this makes it the earliest instance of what Tanner again describes as a strong erotic charge in Wagner's music that would seem to indicate that a sexual act is imminent or is even being performed, but in musical code. One of the first people to appreciate this was Baudelaire, whose 1860 essay, Richard Wagner and Tannhäuser in Paris, attempted to paraphrase the music as follows, and arguably gets as close to the effect music as mere words can. Languidness and febrile delights, delights fraught with anguish, incessant twists and turns towards that voluptuousness which promises to slake but which never extinguishes thirst. Furious palpitations of the heart and senses, imperious demands of the flesh, diabolical titillations of an ill-defined love, allurements, vertigo, cries of triumph, moans of gratitude. Wagner next followed Tannhäuser without a break with Lohengrin, the romantic legend of the Knight of the Swan. And here, yet again, he sets a supernatural tale within an historical framework, this time taking us all the way back to the first half of the 10th century, the reign of Henry the Fowler, first feudal overlord of the Germans and defender of Christendom against the barbarian hordes in the east, all of which is again referenced within the opera and helps to ground it in a firmly believable reality. And then, as in The Flying Dutchman, Wagner introduces a larger-than-life figure who is clearly not of this world and who thereby appears to tower head and shoulders over everyone else, King Henry included. There's a crucial difference, however. Where the Dutchman was a demonic figure, Lohengrin is equally obviously an angelic one. He's a champion of justice, defender and protector of the downtrodden, the almost stereotypical knight in shining armour sent to answer the prayers of a damsel in distress, although only on the firm condition that his true identity remain hidden. So in place of the Dracula pattern, Wagner is now foreshadowing that of Superman. In fact, Lohengrin is the first of a new kind of Wagnerian hero, the polar opposite to the primary kind, and essentially the other side of the same coin. As we saw, Tanner's definition of the first type was people who had all too much of a past. By contrast, he calls the other type people who had no past, innocence, ignoramuses. Lohengrin, not actually an ignoramus, is undeniably an innocent, a semi-divine being apparently untouched by human fallibility and weakness, though compassionate towards it in those he meets. Unlike his two predecessors, then, he no longer represents the romantic artist's curse or burden, but rather his sense of having a sacred mission. As such, the question Lohengrin forbids those he saves to ask him, a variation on who was that masked man, clearly reflects Wagner's obvious need for an equally unquestioning acceptance from his own audience. After all, the music demands all the time complete surrender to a sublime experience that is meant to be self-evident and so taken for granted. But that in this case the virtuous maiden turns out to fail the hero by breaking his taboo and so obliging him to return to where he came from, again voices the underlying paranoia that the world would prove unworthy of its redeemer. Despite this, he is resoundingly vindicated by Lohengrin's climactic revelation as a servant of the Holy Grail, something that also, perhaps surprisingly, marks a further development of the erotic theme of Tannhäuser. This is because Wagner, in this respect closer to the British than the German tradition, describes the Grail specifically as a cup or a chalice, and in doing so quite clearly foreshadows the work of Sir James Fraser, Jessie Weston, T.S. Eliot, in characterising the Grail as, in some sense, a female fertility symbol, just as the flowering staff in Tannhäuser is a male one. Well, hermaphroditic, I suppose. What this now suggests is that Wagner is moving beyond the literal depiction of sexuality and dealing instead with its sublimation into a spiritual experience. And this, of course, is precisely the thing that his own art has been increasingly aspiring towards doing. This is once more most clearly demonstrated by the music itself, which in this instance has been carefully designed to express a state of bliss that is utterly ineffable, altogether transcending the flesh. And the visionary experience involved is clearly outlined in the composer's program notes for the Act 1 prelude. Out of the clear blue ether of the sky, there seems to condense a wonderful, yet at first hardly perceptible vision. And out of this there gradually emerges, ever more and more clearly, an angel host, bearing in its midst the sacred Grail. As it approaches earth, it pours out exquisite odours, like streams of gold, ravishing the senses of the beholder.